Welcome to Blockhouse Bay Baptist Church on this 31st of October, 2021. Glad that you've joined us as we continue our series on glimpsing God in Genesis, as we seek to understand how God speaks through the stories that are in the first book of the Bible. There's lots of different ways that God does this, and it's exciting to see that in this text. I can remember when I was in early high school, going to church in the summertime at this rural church that I grew up in. I wore pants and shirt like this and my dress shoes, but no socks. On the week following, the pastor's wife came and just let me know that her daughter had noticed that I didn't wear socks with my shoes and wondered if she could do the same thing. In reality, she's just letting me know that be mindful that people are watching and you have an influence. But what it reminds me actually of is that clothes and the way that we dress does matter or impact on how we come to church, at least people's perception, right? It speaks to this idea that as we come to church, we should dress a certain way, act a certain way, in part because we are seeking to, I suppose, demonstrate a sense of reverence, a sense of we approach appropriately to the God that we seek to serve and worship, as well as we care for those who are in community with us. But some of the problem with that particular protocol, and if you remember, the discussions that happen around when suits and ties change to just ties, to just shirts with collars, to now you can wear whatever you want to, each of those transitions had a particular tension around the conversation. But I think what the reality is that it also speaks to something deeper, right? As we seek to be mature people who come having been in church for a while, we learn the way that we should act, to learn the ways that we should care for each other, the ways that we should behave in church and dress in church. It speaks to a maturity. But sometimes that maturity hides the reality that's going on behind that appropriateness of how we come to church, and that there's mess in our lives, and we don't want to admit it. If we come to church and you are smiley, and you are wearing your good clothes, and you say hello nicely, and you leave nicely, you can fake it for an hour and a half and act as if there's nothing going on. And that protocol and the way that we act at church sometimes can help us to do that and act as if nothing is the matter. But this comes into tension, though, with the reality that as if we acted good at church and people come in the door who are publicly a bit more messy, they've got problems that they kind of hang out, or they talk about, or they raise questions in the sermon which maybe isn't appropriate, or they just do interesting things, or they admit that they have actually issues. As a church, we're like, wait a minute, this doesn't fit how we're supposed to act. You're not acting the way that you're supposed to act as a mature person coming to church. But we know also that Jesus is the one who welcomed those kind of people to himself, and we were seeking to do that, but we also recognize there's an uncomfortability because they're not acting mature. They're not acting the way that they appropriately should when they come to church. Everybody knows how you should act at church. But the mess that hangs out reveals to us that we're uncomfortable with the mess behind our closed doors. But we also know there's a danger if we just say, oh, that's right, we need to admit our mess. And everybody comes in and lets their mess hang out. We begin to celebrate the authenticity of sharing your mess. And then the mess itself becomes a good thing. And we don't really seek to grow or mature. And so we just hang out celebrating the mess that we're in and act as if that's the norm. And we don't grow past that. That's a problem too. And so we can't have maturity without mess, but how do we walk that tension? Well, I think as we think about that problem or that question, that as we continue our study in Genesis, we get to the beginning of Joseph's story, Genesis 37, which does help us to think about how we ought to approach that question, that problem of maturity and mess. So if you haven't read Genesis 37, I invite you to do so now and come back. Okay, so you've read Genesis 37. It's a great little story, isn't it? Now I want you to read it again after we're done to go and check to see if what I've said makes sense to you, but also is true to the text and helps you to see the ways that we can approach this maturity and mess. But I just want to highlight that because Genesis 37 is the part of the beginning of the story, it's again going to set the stage. It's going to carry on to the end of Genesis. And the major character, Joseph, is the way that God works through his covenant faithfulness to his people. But I just want to remind you as a story, there's lots of things in there that invite our reflection. And here's just a couple of things to remind you of that, and then I want you to see if you can make those connections for yourself. One is that we realize that Jacob has been a person who has been favored and continues to favor, and that favoring creates problems and chaos in his life. Two, Jacob deceived his father with goat's meat and certain clothing. And Jacob himself is now deceived by goat's blood and a piece of clothing. The older-younger dynamic has been a consistent one in the Old Testament. Already you can see it a bit in Genesis, and it carries on through other parts. But God continues to work through the younger over the older to keep upturning or overturning the standard way that people thought this is the way it's supposed to happen. This is the right policy for maturity in life, and God keeps delighting in upturning or overturning that. In Shechem, that place that these brothers take their sheep to, if you remember a couple chapters back, that's the place where they did a little bit of a massacre for those who raped Dinah. It's a questionable place to go because it might be full of tension in and of itself. And Reuben and Judah are two characters that play a part in Genesis 37, but if you read their stories on either side, you realize that they may be seeking favor, seeking some sort of dynamic in their relationship with Jacob that plays into this story as well. So just keep in mind of those. Now, how does Genesis 37 talk to our question of maturity and mess in church? Well, you might think that Genesis 37 should, again, tell the story of a mature family, right? They've been around God for a while. They know a bit of how he acts, but what do we find? We find three major characters in a mess. So let's think about them in order. Right? We've got Father Jacob, who, again, has shown favoritism to his son Joseph, to the point that he's set him aside with a special coat. He listens to his tattling, and he even at the end where he thinks that Joseph is dead, has mourned and will not come out of mourning. He's shown a particular favoritism. And that favoritism has created chaos, right? It creates tension in the family. It sets Joseph out apart. It creates frustration for his brothers. And it also demonstrates, I think, in Jacob, this inability to deal with his own self. There's a lack of self-control in the way that he should appropriately care for his whole family. And there's a lack of discipline, right? He doesn't go after his sons in the way that he ought to in pushing their character for development. He just goes after what he wants. And so Jacob's favoritism really is a mess that creates chaos and problems. And then we go to Joseph, right? Joseph is the major character of the story, but Joseph, he's given a special privilege. He is allowed to tattle on his brothers. He's watched out for. He's got this favoritism from his father, even by his coat, which seems to indicate some sort of change of status. But then he has these dreams. And those dreams highlight the fact that he's going to somehow be elevated above his brothers. But rather than think about him and keep him to himself, what does he do? He just blats it out. Hey, guys, I want you to tell you, I'm going to be above you. I'm going to be over you. And they get really angry with him. And he has another one. And it's rather than realizing that his brothers have been angry through the text time and time again, the text highlights they're just so mad at him. He says it one more time. He's so full of himself. He's so arrogant. He's such a brat. He's spoiled by this favoritism that he is blind to his own arrogance and thinks of his own importance. And then the brothers who are, you could say, rightfully angry, right? They are being sidelined by a younger brother. They're having to go do extra work while Joseph gets to hang around and oversee. They don't have a special coat like he does. They don't have the same favor. And then all of a sudden he has these dreams, which they perceive as being, I think, from God. In some ways, or at least special or unique, where they recognize he's saying he's going to be over them, and they hate it. They are jealous, and what do? Well, they move to envy, where they seek not only to take that power away from Joseph, but to make sure that Joseph doesn't have it himself. And so they plot to kill him, or at least to remove him from the picture as we tell the story. And so we see that in Genesis 37, 1 through 11, this dynamic that sets up the rest of the story, but it's a family that's a mess. A father who shows favoritism and lack of self-discipline and control. Joseph, a son who's favored, who shows a bunch of arrogance and pride. And these brothers who are envious and jealous and seek murder in their hearts. And so what happens? Well, the rest of Genesis 37, the brothers head off far away, about 105 kilometers away from Hebron. And Joseph goes to find them, thinking that he's invisible, as does Jacob think so too. And we see that Joseph is slotted for murder. His brother's like, what are we going to do with this dreamer, this guy who thinks that he's going to be above us? And so they plot to kill. Two brothers stand in and say, nah, maybe we should change our tactic a little bit. They throw him in a pit. And then along comes a caravan. And so the brothers sell him for 20 shekels, which is the price of a slave at that time. Kind of narrates it in his historical reality. And they gain what would be 2 years' worth of salary for one shepherd. So they split that among themselves, go back, and they present this cloak with blood on it to the father, and they believe. He grieves, he's dead, and all problems have been taken care of. But we realize that things are not the way they're supposed to be. It's a mess. So what should we learn about this? Well, it's interesting that this story entails three people who God has been working in and through that are a mess. And we should recognize that it doesn't matter whether you're old like Jacob, who's been around God a long time, or you're middle-aged like the brothers, or you're young like Joseph. They all have mess in their lives. And we must first and foremost recognize that the Bible does not shy away from the fact that you and I have mess. These guys had mess, we have mess. And we dare not avoid that truth. We dare not act like we've matured past it. We dare not act like we can cover it up or hide it. What we see in this story is that no matter the mess creates consequences, it creates dynamics and difficulty, it creates chaos, and those things are going to work themselves out into people's lives. It's going to affect and impact and hurt people. So the mess that we have does bring consequences. It does bring natural things to bear. It does create problems in the life that we live. And so we best admit to the fact that there is mess. So what is it in your life? Now, the flip side of this, I think what's so fascinating is that as much as there's a mess, we must recognize something else is going on in the story of Joseph. Now, as Joseph is the primary character, let's just think about this. At the end of Joseph's story, we know all of you intended these things for evil, but God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people. God is at work. And one of the things we must really recognize is that no matter the mess in our lives and the consequences that come from it, God is still at work in the mess. And so when we look at Joseph, we realize Joseph is an arrogant, favored brat. And yet he has given a dream by the God who is promising to work through Adam and Jacob and Isaac and more people after him. That God is going to work through those people. And so God gives him a dream, enough to know that there's a special place in his life. And then further, as Joseph has this dream, and as much as he tells and just does something stupid with it, God is still at work. And so when the brothers head off and Joseph is sent to go find him, he's lost, wandering. And he runs into somebody who happens to have heard the brothers converse about where they're going to go and says, you should keep on following that way. It seems like God's hand is over Jacob to guide him to where he needs to be. And so when the brothers see him, they intend on murder, throw him in a pit, and what do you know? Here comes a caravan at just the right time to take Joseph away to where he will, we know, grow and mature. God consistently and faithfully works in the mess of our lives and in the mess of the lives of the biblical people. We must recognize that the flip side of the mess that we admit to is the same stuff that God works through to bring maturity. And so we must recognize that mess is not something that frightens God, scares God away, or it means he is unable to work. But God is more than capable to work through the mess. Now you might say, wow, that's pretty crazy. I'm not so sure I believe that. Well, think about Joseph as an example of that as we keep on reading his story. But also think about Jesus Christ, right? Is not his life surrounded by mess and people give him injustice? He's communicating how God is going to be and people disbelieve him and doubt him. And he gets this false trial and accusation. He's doubted and questioned by all the leadership. And he's killed and everybody thinks, yay! And that's all injustice and mess. And what does God do through it? The mess of that injustice, Jesus is raised to new life and offers salvation, just like Joseph gave salvation or offered that to others by nature of food. Jesus offers it in the ultimate ways of saying, I will deal with your mess through my life and through my death. And so Jesus is the one who comes and works in mess to bring maturity to people. And we as Christians, people who follow Jesus, are called to say, we get to walk into mess. We walk into other people's messes, we walk into our own mess, and God promises by his Spirit to work through that mess to bring about maturity to us, but to bring about his kingdom come. He has promised to bring change in our culture, in our church, in our families, because of the mess that is being matured through Jesus' love, Spirit, and sacrifice. And so I want us to consider this as we come to the end of reading Genesis 37, that God is inviting us as a church to realize that we must own up to the fact that we are messy people. Yes, I think it's okay to dress up for church, but I also think it's okay to actually admit that we have mess in our lives. If we all come to church acting like we don't have a mess, we're in deep trouble, because everybody can see it and everybody knows it. We all know that we have mess, but we don't admit to it. Why? When God is so good and faithful to work through the mess. So first and foremost, let's admit we have mess in our lives, and let's be honest about it. So this week I ask you to take a few moments and just reflect, where is the mess in your life? The most prominent one. Is it pride? Is it envy? Is it favoritism or lack of self-control? Is it stubbornness? Is it greed? Is it sexual immorality? Is it foolishness or laziness? I don't know what it is, but admit to it. And second, I want you to come to Christ and confess it and ask for his help to work in you like he worked in Joseph and his brothers and in Jacob, to keep bringing maturity through that mess. And thirdly, I want you to recognize that Joseph, his mess and his elevation in that mess of maturity is not for himself, but it's for the good of other people. Sometimes in our mess, it's good for us to come and ask for help. And sometimes for us who are mature and are struggling with mess or have struggled with mess, it's good for us to help others. So I'm going to ask you who in your life that you can go to ask for help or to give help. Let's be a people who are willing to be mature for the benefit of others through the messes that we've gone through. Let's let Joseph, Jacob, and his brothers remind us that God is not afraid of mess, but God longs and will and is able to work maturity through the messes of our lives, through the life of our church, the lives of our community, the lives of our nation. God is interested in working maturity through mess. Let's carry on that journey. Peace.